To dwell above with saints we love, oh, that will be glory. But to dwell below with the saints we know, well, that's another story. In many ways, most of us as members of a faith community, we end up acting like porcupines. When I was interviewed for my last position as rector in Niantic 10 years ago, they asked me all sorts of questions about outreach and my preaching and pastoral care. And then when somebody said to me, how do you deal with church conflict? And I said, well, I think most people, I look at most people in a conflicted situation like they're porcupines. You know, porcupines in a cold night, for instance, they all want to seek a warm place. So they all sort of go in the same direction. They all have the same goal, and they all have the same intention to go where they're going to be safe. But oftentimes, those porcupines get into such a small place that they start sticking each other with their quills. And I think if you look at your back a little bit, you've probably got a few quills sticking out of you. I do. Sometimes I look like a porcupine. But those conflicted situations are the things that sort of get in the way of our relationship with one another and our relationship with Christ. Even on this wonderful homecoming Sunday, all of the relationships that I have seen celebrated in the last couple of days between this wonderful community of music that has strengthened and sustained Christ Church for so many years, even in that midst, there are a few porcupines. There are a few porcupines with the clergy, a few porcupines on committees, a few porcupines with pastoral care, a few porcupines with property, not necessarily here, I'm talking about in general. And I think if we remember ourselves as being porcupines, we might be just a bit more susceptible to being thoughtful, or at least a little more considerate about how we position ourselves, even when we're all going in the same direction, we all have the same goal, and we all have the same intention. We don't all go about it with the same methods. And it's amazing to me that reading this 2,000-year-old gospel that Matthew wrote, quoting Jesus about being very specific about how do you deal with somebody who is acting up, if you will. And he says, if you can talk to him and you convince him, you've won that one. But if not, get a couple other people. So he's very specific about the sort of the process of this. But in our time, I think there has become sort of this woke morality. This woke morality that says you're wrong. There's nothing you can do to redeem yourself. You're full of hate, and there's no sense in if you even repenting, because we won't forgive you. You just have to grovel. It's a morality of we've got this right, and we're making up new laws as we go along, and when we're wrong, when you are wrong and you're staying wrong, and we're glad you're wrong, and we're going to rub your nose in it. That's sort of this virtue signaling that goes on and canceling people in our culture because the way they act differently from our supposed open morality. That was a quote, by the way, from Bishop N.T. Wright, the former Bishop of Norwich, England. Loving your enemy is something that we are called to do. That's very counterintuitive. Loving your enemy? I recall one year, one of the many shootings that we are told about in the 24-hour news cycle that we're subjected to, about a young black man who was shot and killed by a policeman, and it was determined that he was wrongly killed, and the deceased boy's mother came to the microphones for a news conference, and the very first thing she said out of her mouth was, "I forgive the officer who shot my son." I was speechless. I was watching the television and I was speechless. It's that kind of pure, unrestricted forgiveness that Jesus is talking about. Now, forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean reconciliation. Reconciliation takes two, but it has to begin with forgiveness. It has to begin with us. It has to begin with the way that we position ourselves in relationships so that we can honor one another and resolve differences. The church is no sanctuary from this kind of behavior, and sometimes we can be worse than anywhere else in the culture, but it should never be. I always like to talk about this bag of rocks that we all carry around. And we all have one. We all have a broken relationship or two in our lives. And we put those rocks in this bag of rocks that we drag around with us, almost like a ball and chain, that we submit to in many ways, this weight that we carry, and we won't let go of it. In my former profession years ago, 27 years ago, when I would meet with a family to make funeral arrangements, family members would gather. Some would come from New Hampshire, some from South Carolina, and they would sit at the conference table, and it became evidently clear that the brother and sister were not talking to each other. They hated each other. And they apologized to me because we're sorry that our family has this conflict. And I was thinking, I always thought to myself, well, you didn't invent it. Every family I've ever made arrangements with, I would say, has the same predicament. We all have that. We all have that in our lives. We all have those quills that are stuck to our back. And pulling them out is very difficult work. The healing of those relationships, to embrace the other, to forgive, and even to love our enemy. We come here to this sacred meal week after week to celebrate in Thanksgiving God's grace in our lives. The kind of grace that has sustained this music program for so many years, the kind of grace that has blessed this parish with George Kent's leadership for so many years, the kind of grace that binds us together in a worshiping community to be here for one another and to be here for Christ, to be here to embrace Christ, to take him into our heart, and then go out into the world and give that gift away. It seems like bad math, but it works. We accumulate all of this wonderful love in our relationships, and then we go out into the world and we give it away. We share it. We embrace the other so that they know that they are welcome here, a safe place. Robert Putnam wrote a book years ago called Bowling Alone, and Christ Church is bucking the tide of the thesis behind that book, that everyone is sort of isolated and no one is going to engage in community groups. He wrote this over 20 years ago, and it was very prophetic. I recall being president of the Mystic Lions Club 35 years ago. We had 120 members. I think they have 12 now. The Rotary Club looks for members, the Elks Club, the community boards, the civic boards of government are always looking for members to serve. We are reluctant to engage, and this place becomes, for us at least, the oasis where we can gather in relationship with Christ. Well, we take that love out into the world. I think sometimes I like to have microphones and speakers on the outside of the church when we sing the Gloria, to let the world know. But we can't do that. So you have to be the one to let the world know. You have to be the ones to share that grace, avoiding some of your porcupine quills. It's a possibility. God's grace gives us the ability to do just that. Because with God's grace, everything is possible. That's the blessing. That's why we gather here. That's why we pray. That's why we sing. That's why we love one another. To make the whole world new. Blessings, my fellow porcupines.